person has to be able to determine important matters of a U.S. business. While CFIUS has interpreted this very broadly, some have claimed that its discretion needs to expand even further. However, if we now make an exception to that control standard, we should be very clear on the reasons why. Broad brush changes that could sweep up thousands of innocuous transactions would not be helpful. Instead, we should ask which countries we're concerned about and what it is about non-controlling transactions that CFIUS needs to look at. It goes without saying that we have special concerns about China and critical technologies. And if that is the case, we should probably try to target CFIUS changes accordingly, not expand its authorities across the globe and across industries, only to later carve out every country and business we can until we're just left with China and critical technologies. Third, we need to tailor changes to realistic expectations about our government's capacity to execute them. Here again, implementation matters. It does nothing to strengthen our national security if we load CFIUS with unfunded mandates or offer proposals that may take years to write the rules for, when what we really need is a nimble and adaptable response to the immediate risks right in front of us. I'll draw an analogy from the financial services arena that Mr. Lowery is familiar with, and an analogy that he brought forward in his testimony, and that is the Volcker Rule. Whatever one's views are on the Volcker Rule policy, I think most people, I would hope everyone, could agree that this simple idea became immensely complex and burdensome once it came to writing and implementing the regulations. In fact, just this morning, Mr. Hill and our committee brought to the House floor a legislation to fix and simplify and streamline the Volcker Rule that received, I think, around 300 votes, a bipartisan vote in the House, which underscores how complicated the Volcker Rule has become in its implementation. We don't want that to happen to CFIUS as well. Everyone should agree that we should not have an overly complex system. And that cautionary tale does apply to CFIUS. Let's not kid ourselves that good intentions are manageable once they're enacted into law. We have to make sure that the process is manageable in practice. And the final point I'd like to make is this. We need to be aware of the impact our actions have on policy in other countries. The United States is the world's leader on international economic cooperation, and foreign governments take what we do seriously. If they are to emulate what we do with investment reviews, we want to emulate a system that we can accept when our companies go abroad to invest. At the very least, we want to continue sending a signal to our trading partners that America is open for business and that foreign investment helps our growth, our innovation, and yes, our national security. So all of this is about balance. It's about applauding the efforts that Robert Pittenger and Senator Cornyn and Mr. Heck have made, important contributions. We need to update CFIUS. We need to take the threats from China seriously. But while we do so, we need to be careful that we do not unduly burden or prejudice benign foreign investment. And that is the balance we are seeking to achieve in this process. And again, we want to thank American Action Forum for this opportunity, and would be happy to answer any questions along with Mr. Pittenger after he gets a chance to say a few words. Thank you very much.
And we are doubly blessed to have a second member to address us, Robert Pittenger, who has the 9th District of North Carolina, which includes Charlotte, the second largest financial center in the United States. Congressman.
Thank you, Doug. Sure appreciate your leadership on this. It means a great deal to all of us. And sure appreciate Chairman Barr, great friend, your intense involvement in this effort. It's got to be done and done right. Each of us are aware that the Chinese government has been utilizing weaponized foreign investments to steal state-of-the-art military applicable technologies from U.S. firms. This has resulted in massive transfers of dual-use technology from U.S. firms to Chinese entities with close ties to the Chinese government. Recognized by Secretary Mattis, who requested the FIRMA bill, along with 5 previous Secretaries of Defense who have also endorsed this bill, as well as the chairs of the intelligence committees in the House and Senate, bipartisan. The stolen technology and know-how has been instrumental in China's military buildup and modernization efforts, and has denigrated America's military-industrial base and alarmingly depleted our technological superiority. Can't overstate the seriousness of what we're discussing today. However, if some of you are old enough to recall Sergeant Friday on Dragnet, just the facts, man, just the facts. Let's take a look at some of what's been discussed about FIRMA and discern between what might be consideration and myth and what really is the fact about what we're trying to accomplish. FIRMA only captures critical defense applicable transactions. Secretaries Mnuchin and Mattis have both testified that CFIUS review over certain outbound joint ventures in critical industries is an urgent national security necessity. Myth. FIRMA would expand covered transactions by 20,000. Fact. FIRMA was written with Secretary Mnuchin and the Treasury Department. They understand the workload and have requested the expanded coverage. Tens of thousands of national security sensitive transactions don't receive CFIUS review, and Treasury has requested increased coverage. Treasury expects an increase, but individuals who claim the increased coverage will grow by 20,000 are misleading in an effort to protect the status quo. Myth. Export controls alone can fill the national security deficiencies identified by FIRMA. Fact. Export controls do not review risk associated with the broader business transaction. They only review covered technologies that are identified on their control list. This list does not cover emerging technologies. Secretary Ross and the Commerce Department have endorsed FIRMA and as our legislation that appropriately fills gaps identified in the export control and CFIUS process. Myth. Strengthening export control can replace the outbound joint venture section of FIRMA. Fact. In theory, it could if you legislated a completely new export control hybrid that included a new interagency review process that also reviewed risk associated with the underlying business transaction. Currently, an export control review is not interagency, does not include a mandatory intelligence community assessment, and does not review the nature of the business transaction. Myth. The entire technology industry opposes FIRMA. Well, fact. Ericsson and Oracle have both written strong letters of support for this bill, and co-authors have worked at length with industry to streamline the bill to keep it laser focused on national security. In fact, we are on our third rewrite of this bill to date. Myth. FIRMA will create a mandatory CFIUS process. Fact. CFIUS remains a voluntary process with the exception that state-owned enterprises with a 25% or more stake in the acquisition will have to file a mandatory declaration to Treasury. Myth. FIRMA would disrupt overall FDI in the United States. Fact. In many instances, FIRMA actually improves FDI. FIRMA would authorize a so-called, quote, good guys list of countries that would have an accelerated FDI process into the U.S. To qualify, countries would enter into their negotiations with Treasury to implement a CFIUS-like process in their own country. Myth. FIRMA would take years to implement, and a CFIUS review could now take years to adjudicate. Well, the fact, while the bill does not prescribe an implementation date, Treasury does not anticipate at all a multi-year process to implement the bill. The bill was drafted by the Treasury to allow for swift implementation. CFIUS still needs to take action to notify parties within 30 days, and the committee would have 45 days to complete the review. All of this is relative to our discussion and our final conclusion of what needs to be done to protect American technology from being transferred to foreign countries who are our adversaries. Thank you very much for your time.
We have about 5 minutes of, we have 0 minutes of scarce Pittenger time. Thank you, Congressman.
I guess we mind going and taking the
If
seats
we have
behind the.
questions for Congressman Barr, I think we get him for a couple
Just taking the seats behind the row back here.
If you have a question, please
Yeah,
identify
so people all the
yourself,
way
ask
to
your
the
question in the
podium.
form of a question with a question mark at the end.
Are we allowed to
These
sign
copies are outside
Yes, yeah,
of
please.
the fact if you want a copy.
Thanks.
So if you guys wouldn't mind just moving to the back row to approach with Lowery. Thank you.
So there's different, I think there's,
Just go to the around to like.
what we intend to do in the committee is to offer managers and incorporate some of the changes that Mr. Pittenger's team have been working on and Treasury, in addition to some of our own thoughts. So the current version that's out there is really the only version that's been dropped. So you can anticipate a manager's amendment being offered in a markup. That would reflect that. It would reflect some of those changes. I do anticipate relatively soon we would be heading towards a markup within the next month for sure.
It would be great to see that.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'd be happy to talk to you about that. Sure.
Time for one more.
Yes, sir.
Rob Weider from ACG Analytics. Do you view Congressman Royce's export control reform bill as consistent or competing with the CFIUS reform bill?
Well, we intend to make it consistent with it. The idea of the manager's amendment will be to have those two legislative products work hand in glove. And again, they need to be complementary. They target different things. The export control bill, which is a very good bill, and I applaud Mr. Royce's work on that, is focused on outbound technology transfer, whether there's a transaction or not. These outbound joint ventures, we believe, are best dealt with through the export control system. And that's why updating that system is important to our national security, and we think that's the appropriate place jurisdictionally for addressing and confronting malign technology transfer in an outbound fashion. At the same time, we need to look at the inbound investments, perhaps with a focus on those non-controlling inbound investments that are presently not captured by CFIUS. Some of the real estate transactions that are currently not covered by CFIUS, transactions involving, say, a Chinese acquisition of real property near and around a sensitive military site. That would be an example of new modernization of CFIUS that is currently not in the status quo. But those two, a manager's amendment on CFIUS along with Mr. Royce's bill will be very complementary.
Please join me in thanking Congressman Barr.
Thank you.
So this is a good moment for some crowd management. There are some seats here, which people are welcome to use while the panel gets seated. We are delighted today to have Saleha Moses from Bloomberg as the moderator for our panel. Saleha has covered this issue extensively and has a background at Bloomberg, at the Associated Press, at the Wall Street Journal, and introduce her to introduce the panel. Thank you, Saleha.
So we have next to me is Riley, who is a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Kevin Wolf from Akin, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Clay Lowery from Rock Creek Global Collective. And we'll kick it off fast. Well, just to get straight to the point, what is wrong with CFIUS right now? I know you don't think there's wrong.
Oh, no. I think most people are in general consensus that, CFIUS has done well. The issue isn't the change in the committee itself, the changes in the perception of Chinese investment. And, going forward, I think, a lot of people think that the committee is inefficient. I would say it's flexible. So, being able to address some of the concerns that we have, it's applicable to be more explicit in what you want to see from investment in these requirements, but at the same time, you don't want to constrict the committee.
I'll let you answer that one.
So
what's wrong with CFIUS now. I think probably the key issue right now is the biggest problem is resources. Every single person who's testified on this bill in the Senate and the House, whether they are in favor of the bill, against the bill, or sort of down the middle of the road, has said the exact same thing. CFIUS is overwhelmed. It's made it inefficient. I talked to a practitioner just the other day who said, in the past, when we used to tell our clients, put in your once we put in our filing, and once CFIUS goes through it, it would probably take all in about 6 weeks. Or if you're a foreign government-controlled company, or frankly a Chinese company, it will probably take about 3 months. They said, we tell everybody just prepare for 6 months now. And the reason is because I think CFIUS is dealing with a lot more cases and a lot more complex cases. So dealing with that issue, which is not really necessarily part of the legislation, is a very important part. Now, in terms of what the legislation has identified a couple of holes in CFIUS. One is whether or not foreign companies are buying non-controlling stakes in companies and still getting access that the public couldn't get to specific technology. So this would be, some people call this the kind of the joint venture, the startup capital provision. And so I think that should be looked at, and I think the bill reflects that. There's some issues within the bill that probably need to be dealt with, and some of that can be done through rulemaking. The real estate provision is one that just has to be cordoned off a little bit, because otherwise it'll be too massive. But I think that it's an interesting point about whether or not someone buys real estate. That was what's considered a greenfield investment. So you're not buying an existing business, you're buying something here. And now CFIUS deals with that all the time, by the way. But this is a way of doing it when there's not a national security asset at stake. So I think those are some of the holes that I see. There's some other parts of the bill that create much, much greater problems that I'm not as convinced are such a big hole in CFIUS.
First, as a general comment, this has been a terrific example of a regular order, nonpartisan debate with good faith commentary to solve legitimate problems. So I know we all live in Washington and see what's going on. Generally, well, that's not always the case, but everybody who's been involved in this on the Hill, and staff and industry, should be complimented for having a very thoughtful, informed discussion of a serious issue. So to take the answer to the question up a stage, I think it's that the export control system and CFIUS have historically gotten very good at knowing what they know, and that a process to identify creatively emerging technologies and the next threats, the next issues of concern, isn't as baked as well into the export control and CFIUS system as it should be. And so I actually applaud, Congressman Pittenger and Senator Cornyn for raising this issue and raising the issue of emerging technology and tying it to new technology acquisition threats that are legitimate. And most of what I've been doing is articulating that in many ways the process already exists, with a greater emphasis to the administration for identifying those emerging technologies of concern through a regular order process in an existing technology transfer system, which is the export control system. And I've got a 3-minute and a 30-minute and a 3-hour version of that answer, but that's the 3-minute answer.
So it sounds like from what we heard from our speakers that China is the biggest threat. The version of the bill as we have it today, is that enough to address that threat?
Well, I mean, the bill does add some interesting aspects, right? It sort of implicitly creates a bad actors list, and then explicitly creates a sort of good actors list. So we can kind of separate out the people we want investment from versus the people we are more skeptical of investment from. Will it be enough to address sort of concerns that have been highlighted? A lot of people reference the DIUX report. I would say I think CFIUS can in what CFIUS is good at doing, which is reviewing investment. A lot of the concerns that were brought up in these reports weren't necessarily something that are concerns for investment or concerns for CFIUS. So like, what the administration's doing right now with Section 301, these aren't necessarily aspects that can deal with information that's already been stolen, right? So there are other mechanisms I think exist or could be created outside the CFIUS framework, but I think with dealing with China, I think there's some good policies within the bill.
So with respect to China or any other country that seeks to acquire emerging technologies of concern that could be used to modernize the military to the detriment of U.S. national security, that's the good thing about what the CFIUS debate has raised greater attention to. And within the export control system, there is a process now that exists to the extent that any particular country, the export of technology of concern that's not now part of the export control list should be added, could be added. And what CFIUS has done and what the Royce bill explicitly does in section 109 of this bill is to require the export control system to give greater emphasis to identifying what the types of technologies that are not now controlled but should be, having a regular interagency process to identify those technologies, working it through the industry to make sure that the descriptions are clear and understandable and that predictability and clarity and reliability in the system won't unintentionally harm foreign direct investment, and a process by which it can be done immediately and quickly, but with the requirement that it eventually be made part of the multilateral export control system so that it's not only the United States that is out in front in imposing these controls. Because history has shown that the best controls are those that are imposed by our allies, and if it's only a U.S. type of control or limitation or trade restriction, then that work and investment and creativity and innovation simply moves to other allied countries.
I don't have really much to add. I was just going to say, look, CFIUS is one tool that addresses a problem.
Yeah.
And there are a variety of different tools that address other problems. And of course, by the way, we should think about it. I mean, the key for the United States to compete with China in a number of areas is going to be a much more positive agenda than creating CFIUS, or working on CFIUS or export controls. So, which goes well beyond the scope of I think what we're talking about today.
So Clay, we heard from Representative Barr that if we have CFIUS is expanded, its purview is much wider, but if we can't implement it, there's no use in having a stronger bill or a stronger law. There's a user fee that's mentioned in the FIRMA bill. Is that enough to bring the resources that we need, and how quickly would resources have to be ramped up to make it effective quick?
So implementation, this has been my little bugaboo, I guess, about this for a while. So, Congressman Pittenger said that there's no truth to there being 10,000 or 20,000 transactions. That number actually comes from the Defense Department, it doesn't come from a bunch of outside observers. The reason is because there is a provision in the bill that basically, and Kevin knows this better than I do, but it basically it says that we are going to have filings for all transactions that are emerging technology transactions that are not export controlled, that are happening around the world in joint venture arrangements. Those are happening all the time. There are technology companies, there are energy companies, there are companies all over, like they're happening in Brazil, in India, in China, in Singapore, and I'm not even going to talk about the NATO allies because they're part of, I guess, this white list. And so that is just going to drive up the number of transactions. CFIUS currently, and I just told you about how the delays and the resources are a big problem, currently looks at around roughly 200 cases a year. If it jumps to 2,000, that's a 10-fold increase. If it jumps to 20,000, obviously that's a 100-fold increase. But if it jumps to 2,000 transactions, you're going to have to do something. You're going to have to create a staff that is going to have, all of them will have to have security clearances, every single person. They're going to have to be brought in and they're going to have to look at transactions. Now, when you look at a transaction and it's a national security transaction, and that's what CFIUS does every day, a couple of things happen. One, it focuses the mind. It does. It makes you like, geez, this is national security. And the second thing it does is it slows you down and makes it a deliberative process. And especially in CFIUS, which is a committee of a number of agencies, as Congressman Pittenger alluded to. And so that makes the process very slow.
the theory is that, well, all those thousands of transactions, will be able to do triage pretty well. Well, you're doing triage on national security issues. That makes it difficult, because if you miss one, that's a real problem. One, it'll make you wake up in a cold sweat at night, and secondly, you'll be testifying before this body, and it won't be fun. So that, again, slows things down. My own view is those, so CFIUS right now, around the government has roughly about 100 people working on it. Some of those work full-time, some of them don't. But that's roughly right. At Treasury, I think last I looked, there was like 8 people that did this. In the export control world, which is where I think a lot of this resides, there's about 500 people that work on that. They also, by the way, that's what their expertise is. Now, some of them probably have some high technical expertise and some of them don't. But I mean, there's 500 people working on that. In CFIUS, nobody has that expertise outside of the person that they bring in, who's the export control expert, to tell them what's going on. But now we're going to metastasize that so that CFIUS is going to do all those transactions. My view is implementation on this will be very, very difficult. And so in a rulemaking process, it took us 1.5 years to do the changes back in 2007, 2008 when we changed CFIUS. By the sponsors' own words, this is much more, this is not their word, revolutionary than what we did back in 2007, 2008. It took us 1.5 years to do the rulemaking process. I don't know how you would get this done in 2 years, just rulemaking. Then you have to actually start doing real implementation and getting people aboard. So to your point about the numbers, can it be financed by a bunch of fees and so forth? Maybe, and probably. But the thing is like you got to do all these things in the meantime. We'll be lucky to actually implement this bill within 3 years. If this is such an emergency, is that really the steps we should be doing? Last point. Sorry, I took way too long there. Last point is, that doesn't mean, for instance, I'm against reform of CFIUS, or it's just there are portions of the bill that need to be fixed. That's the main point.
So you talk about the urgency in implementing a law to strengthen our protection against national security threats. Do we need a bill? Could some of this be done through executive order?
Well, that was one of the things that I was asked to testify on a couple of times, which is a process that when I was at Commerce, I created called the OY 521 process. That was
Sexy name.
a sexy name. Well, export controls is just like tax law, but without the sexy thing. So, that's one of 5 export control jokes. Stick with me a little bit longer, I'll tell you the other 4. And when we were going through in our day of rewriting all of the controls and lists for the munitions list, the list of military items, and kind of doing this same effort, but exclusively on the military side, we were afraid that we might miss something, and that some technology that was either evolving or that in the drafting process we missed. And we wanted to be able to have the authority to very quickly identify a technology that wasn't listed and control it for release to the end user or destination of concern. And that's sort of the beauty and the vice of export controls, in that they're infinitely tailorable. They can identify specific technologies or general technologies. They can identify groups of countries or the whole world or individual countries or even particular companies or end users in order to impose regulatory transfer requirements. And that authority, just like all of the export administration regulations, is under IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And so the authority actually exists today that if someone at the Defense Department or somewhere else were to say that this algorithm within artificial intelligence or this driverless vehicle subset of technology or this unit of robotics was not somewhere on the control list, and we had information that an adversary was seeking it for use in a bad application or diversion to a military or intelligence application, the legal authority exists today to unilaterally identify it, regulate it, stop its export without permission from the U.S. government. What the CFIUS process has been really, this firmer process, and the Royce bill has been very good about doing, is to say that this sort of ad hoc authority, this ad hoc process that I just described that we created in 2012, should become an add-on institutionally to what the export control system, which is a very vast interagency process system, should be doing on a much more regularized basis. and not get so comfortable with looking at technologies that have already been created related to bombs and weapons and missiles and things that we know exist, but thinking creatively with the new universe of information that's been described in the FIRMA debate. So the authority is there, but it would be better if it were institutionalized, if it were codified in statute, and it were a clear congressional mandate to the administration to frankly do more with more resources than it's doing now.
But if it takes 3 years to get there?
That's the beauty of my idea, in that this authority that I just described can be done today. So let's say someone were, you don't need 3 years, you don't need new regulations, you wouldn't need new law. You could impose those controls on particular technologies to end users and destinations today. The hard work is just in identifying what it is that's not now controlled but should be. So that's the difference. The FIRMA process, and remember, the FIRMA bill gets into a lot of other things other than technology transfer. And CFIUS, when it reviews national security issues, takes into account, espionage issues or personal identifying information issues or co-location next to sensitive military facility issues. Security of supply is a really big deal in terms of if there's a particular company for uncontrolled technology that's a key supplier to the Defense Department or another part of the U.S. government, and an acquisition could have a negative impact on that. And so all of those things are completely unrelated to tech transfer, and FIRMA and CFIUS, I think, do a really good job of addressing those other threats. But on the straight up narrow technology transfer process, Commerce now has the legal authority to do it, and what is required is the creativity and the will and the initiative to find, without doing more harm than good, and that's the hard part, what those subunits of broad areas of technology that should be controlled but aren't, and they could be. So you don't need to wait 3 years to get it.
To expand on that a little bit, I mean, a lot of focus is right now on what CFIUS can and can't do. Or at least what would be changed with the current bill. And I think it's important to highlight, some of the things that are already happening that would sort of affect CFIUS, right? So we already see, Commerce and Treasury and DoD already requesting an increase in budget. The DoD even projected to increase their budget request by 700% to about the number 23 million for next year. I think because of the expectation that reviews could potentially increase up to a couple thousand or more. But on top of sort of like the existing authorities or sort of what's already going on, within the NDAA this past year, there was a section on how DoD and state and I think DHS or DOJ could better collaborate or coordinate on their sort of investment review mechanisms. Not specifically, explicitly saying CFIUS, but would encompass CFIUS. And there was like a 90-day review, I think, that should be done by now, but I don't know, it's not publicly accessible.
Speaking of publicly accessible, just the one element is that businesses, they like clarity, they like predictability. CFIUS by nature cannot provide that with the national security cloud hanging over it. Is there anything that Congress can do to hold it accountable, to bring a little bit of comfort to businesses who are wondering, is the U.S. still the best place to invest?
That's an excellent point on certainty and clarity, because that's absolutely vital to the success of international trade, because if you create clouds into the economic system or the regulatory system about when a transaction will or won't be approved, or more importantly, if it's even covered, that degree of uncertainty discourages investment, particularly in benign investments, and it just simply drives work offshores, and it's harmful. And so one of the sort of types of comments that Clay and I have been making in the various congressional hearings is to bring certainty and clarity and predictability and reliability to what's caught when. And what I mean by that is, in the bill as introduced, the scope of the outbound and inbound investment controls depends upon whether the company involved is a critical technology company. Great concept, seems narrow, seems precise, conceptually makes a lot of sense. However, the definition of a critical technology company is any company that trades in services, develops, produces, and a bunch of other verbs, anything that's on any of the export control lists, including the commercial dual use list, the commerce control list, and an unidentified, unknown list of items that are emerging technologies that the government hasn't identified. And the scope of the inbound and outbound investment provisions would depend upon that company being involved, regardless of whether technology of concern would be released to a foreign person. And so you've already got a system that's not judicially reviewable, where people like Clay and I would sit around with our cloaks over our head in a dark room with low lights making national security judgments. That was a joke, by the way. There's no cloak. The room is correct, but there's no cloak. Anyway, that's not judicially reviewable based on, information that can't be shared for good reason in terms of the reasons for the national security issues involving transactions that won't necessarily involve the release of sensitive technology, only the company, and involving widespread commercial items, things on the Commerce Control List to include ordinary servers and routers and anything with encryption, and also any technologies that only are known to the government, i.e. the unlisted emerging technologies. So in some of the various edits that I've seen coming from Congressman Pittenger and others, and that have been discussed in all the hearings, is to flip the scope of the controls so that they could be knowable, that is, what will and won't be caught within the jurisdiction of CFIUS, by both U.S. and foreign parties. That is, identify the lists of technologies that would be captured to connect the transactions that would be controlled to particular technologies, and don't make it so that companies will not know whether they are or are not within the scope of the bill. And that's all driving to the sort of fundamental aspect of quality international trade, which is it has to have a reliable, predictable regulatory system. So the bill is introduced, had a lot of uncertainty in it. A lot of the edits that I've been seeing floating around are actually moving more in the direction of greater certainty and predictability. Does that answer your question?
Well, is it enough for,
Yeah, okay.
investors?
I haven't seen the final version, so I don't know. So when I see whatever the final version is, the chairman's mark, et cetera, then I'll opine about whether I think that and I'm not saying increase or decrease controls are per se bad. It all depends upon the national security threat. That's what you have to implement. But when I see the final version, then I'll have a better sense for how clear or predictable or reliable it is.
I'm just going to add one thing, which is there's a flaw in the presumption of your question, which is that you keep saying investors. This isn't about investment. There's a very good point. Right now, CFIUS is all about foreign investment in the United States. There's a very large part of the bill, which I actually agree with mainly, that is also about foreign investment in the United States. And then there's a whole portion of the bill that has absolutely nothing to do with foreign investment in the United States. It's about transactions that are going to take place overseas in which a U.S. company or entity is involved, and they basically are getting involved in a joint venture that is happening in Brazil and wherever. And in that transaction, they are going to put forward some technology, and they're going to bring some support with it and some services. And that has very little to do with foreign investment in our country. It has a lot to do with U.S. multinationals, and then of course tech transfers, which is why it starts getting you back into, well, hold it, isn't that what export controls are about? And that's the part of the bill where obviously Mr. Pittenger thinks one thing and I happen to think something else, but that's, so when you said it's about foreign investment, I said it's not about foreign investment. So, but if you're an investor or you're a U.S. company, then you have to go and look at what Kevin was just saying about uncertainty.
Just a summary repeat. So at the heart, the policy motive behind the inbound investment controls and the outbound investment controls is a concern that as a result of that transaction, technology of concern will be released to a foreign person. And so the theme that I've been repeating, which is to the extent that the underlying policy motive, whether inbound or outbound transaction, is with respect to concerns about the transfer of technology, then certainty and reliability and the national security are furthered if that technology is identified and then regulated regardless of the nature of the transaction. That last sentence is the same thing I've been saying for a year now. Does that make sense in terms of predictability? Yeah.
One of the biggest concerns with expanding CFIUS's authority is that it could hamper foreign direct investment, and Secretary Mnuchin has said over and over again that it is not one of the goals. What can Congress do to calm anyone who thinks that this could put up barriers for the kind of investment that we want to attract?
So I think that, there's a few things, right? I mean, first is I would fix the bill in a way that basically makes it still, remember the original CFIUS bill, FINSA now in 2007, has two purposes. Protect national security, everybody knows that one, and promote foreign investment in the United States. It doesn't even say welcome foreign investment, promote foreign investment in the United States. So the best ways to promote foreign investment in the United States is to figure out how do I take transactions that by their nature are tricky, because of course there's some national security involved, and still welcome them. And so my own view is that fix the bill to make it, to keep it a targeted bill and CFIUS a targeted group of people. Second is there's a part of right now current CFIUS, which is you're allowed to do mitigation agreements. So mitigation agreements is essentially basically someone makes an investment, there's some problems with the investment, they might have some national security concerns, but if we can find ways of putting in place mitigants in which the companies will do certain things that the government wants them to do, then we'll allow the investment to go forward. This is actually a great relief valve that allows investments to continue because they're in national security assets, so it's already going to scare you. So here's a way of getting the government a little more comfortable. The bill does address mitigation agreements. I worry sometimes that it scales it back a little bit because having mitigation agreements is really kind of an important thing to allow that to continue onward. A third thing is just create a welcoming environment for foreign investors. Whether that, in the past, people always usually refer to, most presidents of the United States, I think Bill Clinton might be the only exception to this since Reagan, and even it wasn't, I think they just never got around to it, has what's called an open investment welcoming statement, and it says, we welcome foreign investment into the United States. I think President Trump and the administration should do that, but it is something that goes beyond just a statement. You have to actually create the environment and allow for that. We need to welcome foreign investment in the United States for the following reasons. Foreign investment, actually, if you look at manufacturing employment over the last 5 to 10 years, over 50% of manufacturing employment that's been created has been directly related to foreign investment. Remember, and foreign investment there's roughly about, 7 million jobs in the United States that are directly related to foreign investment. Not indirectly, directly related. This is something that is important for U.S. economy. I actually believe most people in Congress recognize this, whether they're Republican or Democrat, whether they're for this bill or against this bill. And so we need to continue to make sure that we look at that and keep our bills fixed for that reason, at the same time, obviously protecting our national security.
So a lot of people might answer that question by saying we need to balance national security with direct investment or economic interests. And I don't use and have never used that concept of balance with respect to CFIUS or export controls, balancing economic and national security interests. A national security interest is a national security interest is a national security interest and needs to be regulated or stopped or prohibited, whatever the topic is. The way in which you accomplish the foreign direct investment objectives, and thanks for laying out the statistics and the long history of the U.S. government, Republican and Democrat, being overtly open to and encouraging of foreign direct investment, is by tailoring the scope of the process to achieve only those national security threats and no more. And at the heart of the CFIUS debate is an interesting philosophical divide between how to address a common policy concern, that is a policy concern that everybody has. You can either have a system that is broad and sweeping that catches most transactions going in and out of the country, and on the theory that we don't really know what we don't know, and we look in each metaphorical investment box going in and out of the country, and if we see something of concern as a government, then we stop it or mitigate it. And let the other 98% go. But we stop and look at everything. The upside of that is that it's very safe. The downside of that is that it creates the very uncertainty and discourages foreign direct investment and creates delays that spook companies from wanting to do business with U.S. companies generally. And that harms the other 98% or whatever the percentage is of the clearly in the end benign transactions. The other approach, which is much harder, requires a lot more work, requires a lot more creative thinking on the part of the government, is to first identify what the threat is from China or the other countries that we are dealing with, and then work backward to tailor what your government prohibitions will be, or regulatory requirements, or investment controls, or licensing obligations will be directly to that threat with an identified list of technologies, the subjects are end users or end users. And that accomplishes your encouraging foreign direct investment point merely through having a much more tailored, efficient system, which I admit up front is much harder to implement as a government than simply, as a regulatory matter rather, than simply regulating everything everywhere all the time, always. So anyway, that's the short answer to your question.
I agree. So, I mean, obviously, CFIUS will not review the majority of most investments coming in. And there are other, things happening like, the reduction of the corporate tax rate, other things that incentivize investment. Even China, has its own capital controls, which, we might see a decrease in investment from them next year anyway. So the question is, so CFIUS is a cost to companies, and the question is, do we want to expand the authorities to increase, that 2% that get reviewed to 10%, and then, do we want to keep it so, they have to go through weeks and weeks of review process and have an additional filing fee? It's the cost that companies have to think about when they want to review or come into the United States. And basically, if this process increases the cost, then there will be a decrease in investment. If it decreases the cost, then there will be an increase in investment. And so I think there's a way to do it where we do balance national security concerns with a decrease in costs. It's being explicit in what we want, and also giving the Treasury Department and so on and so forth the resources that we need.
So let's pull back a little bit. There are 3 main changes in this bill, and maybe we can each take one and kind of just talk through what they are, what's good about them, what's not. The joint ventures, looking at joint ventures. There's looking at non-passive deals, investments, and also real estate close to sensitive sites. We can go through those.
Each one?
Take your pick.
So, I think, I've never worked in CFIUS, so I'm working off of hearsay here. Maybe a gentleman can correct me, but I'm pretty sure CFIUS has the authority to review a number of these already. There already is, a joint venture provision within the FinCIV bill. There has been instances where we've seen CFIUS come in for real estate in the past where there might have been a national security concern. And the passive aspect of it, it depends. I think this goes back to the accessibility part of it. If there's provisions that allow for more passive investment to be pushed through the process of CFIUS, then I think this is a good thing. But if it increases the number of reviews for CFIUS, increasing the burden on the entire system itself, then this could be negative.
So 3 clumps of changes. And I'm kind of repeating what I said a little bit earlier. You have the inbound and outbound investment controls, paragraph B3 and B5 of the definition of covered transaction, or the expanded definition of covered transaction. And the changes that I keep seeing floated, or that I think should be made in any event, are to the extent in which they fundamentally do pertain to technology transfer issues, then let the technology transfer system address the foreign policy objectives, the national security objectives motivating those 2 sections, and they should be changed accordingly, either by removing them and letting completely the export control system handle them, or to tying them explicitly and exclusively to technologies that are identified through an interagency export control license system process. The other change that I've seen is on intercompany transfers. I don't think any of the drafters of the bill are trying to regulate transactions by and between affiliated companies, and there have been various versions of excluding those per se from the scope of the bill, and it's all about wordsmithing about how you get it right. With respect to the real estate transaction point, there hasn't been really any objection philosophically, as far as I can tell from anybody, because the way CFIUS works now is a transaction such as a real estate transaction is only covered if there would be control over a U.S. business, and to the extent it's a business that doesn't exist, it's a greenfield investment, for example, the authority would not exist, and the national security motive behind the real estate controls is they can be fixed sites with a steady source of power that's unobtrusive to monitor telemetry or have access to sensitive military activities at a nearby, naval base, for example. And so philosophically, I don't think anybody objects to allowing CFIUS to have the ability to unwind or alter or block real estate transactions when there isn't an existing U.S. business. It's all about the scoping, about whether every apartment rental, within an army town or something is going to be subject to CFIUS review. And I've seen a half dozen different edits to that to scope it down to a more manageable element. But I'll have to wait to see what the final version is before I can comment on how good it is. So those are the clumps of changes that I've seen, and they're all moving in the right direction, I think. Nothing else to add? Okay.
Should we open up to the audience and see if there's any questions for our panelists?
Clay, maybe this is best for you, because I'm hearing sort of two sides of the quarter from you on the vocal rule analogy and your comment that you think some of the problems with the bill can be dealt with via regulation. Am I mishearing you, or?
Yeah, that's my
word on that.
That's my all right, Riley and Kevin just went through the three provisions of the bill. The two the real estate provision and the venture capital provision, or basically the non-passive, non-controlling investment. This is supposed to be the startup guys in California that have come up with some amazing technology. They don't even know it, and the Chinese come in and buy 3% and basically get a board seat, and so now they can look at that technology. I made that up, but that's basically what we're talking about. That one, I think, some drafting fixes in the bill. Kevin mentioned that there's people working on that, and I think that's right. That, I believe, can even be clarified and made more certain through a rulemaking process that would not be unreasonable. The part that is concerning is the outward bound transactions, and that's because I think that, one, it takes CFIUS, and this is why I was insistent on saying this isn't about foreign investment. It takes it and makes it a non-foreign investment bill, so that's totally different than CFIUS has ever done in the past. And the rulemaking process of that, you're going to have to define such terms as associated support, ordinary customer relationship or ordinary business transaction, whichever version we're talking about, emerging technology, sectors, subsectors, which countries, do we need a list on this? Do we need a list on that? Which agencies are involved? All of this is going to have to be done through a regulatory process that is going to be very complicated. And my worry is, my Volcker analogy, which I'm sure is very imperfect, my Volcker analogy is the rule may have made sense. Maybe it made some sense. But it turned out to be just a nightmare. And no one knows how to implement it. People are trying to make decisions on this or that. So let me give an example from the current bills that I've seen, all of them. If you are a company and you work with a 100% foreign-owned company and you sell them some technology and you provide support for that technology, that under the new bills would not be considered by CFIUS. You do the exact same transaction, but this time you're doing it into a joint venture, which you, the U.S. company, have a portion of. So let's say you have a 20% stake, so you have a joint venture, and you're just licensing the same technology, you're licensing the same support. That now would be captured by CFIUS. All right. Now take that and think about that happening all the time through lots of different companies, some of them who have no idea that there's such a word as CFIUS, outside of they think it's a venereal disease. And so, and so that is what we're going to have to do. I mean, I haven't even thought through the marketing regime that we would have to come up with. And so that's why I'm concerned that we're going to get these kind of anomalous situations happening. And you're going to have to hire a lot of Kevin Wolfs, nothing like Kevin, to try to figure out the law, as opposed to, I'm just trying to do a transaction that I was doing normally anyway. And just to discern so you don't end up in the wrong bucket. And so that's my concern, and that is why I think that part as closer to the bulk rule, and thank you for letting me clarify that.
So, but Kevin, you
Yeah.
said one way to deal with this is you need to specifically identify the technologies that will be problematic, right?
Yes.
But the nature of these California startups is you don't know the technologies that might be. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's this trade-off between the control everything, everywhere, all the time, and the downside, the harm that imposes, versus forcing the government to identify what its threats are first and working backwards and seeing what types of information, what types of technology that the U.S. either has unique or that are directly related to the threat of concern. So the Royce bill sets up a process to go through and identify that type of information. Drawing upon all of the sort of a whole of government approach, not just defense, not just commerce, not just state, but anybody in industry, academia, or in the universities that can look out enough. And these don't have to be precise descriptions down to 5 nanometers above. They can be areas, they can be topics, they can be kinds of information. And even if you can't get to the exact technical parameter of, like 6 microns or 5 gigahertz or whatever it is that you can describe in the export control rules technology that requires permission before releasing, generally at any stage of its development, to any foreign person in the U.S. or abroad. And so to go to Clay's analogy and the fact pattern that he gave of one, it was just a regular purchase and sale agreement of transferring technology, which on day 1 is completely legal. And on day 2, they do the exact same information, releasing exactly the same technology, but through a joint venture, which would be subject to CFIUS. My point is, if that technology is of concern, it should be regulated regardless of whether it's in the first transaction or the second transaction. And that forces you to identify what the areas of technology the government is concerned about and putting it in some form of a list that's developed through this more creative interagency process that I was describing earlier. Does that make sense?
And just to add to that is in the definitional issue of, we need to define that. And, the guys in Silicon Valley are like, what are these people talking about? And then we need to define it. Would you rather define that using the expertise we already have and the tool we already have, export controls, or create this new system that's going to do it? And that's CFIUS. And so, because CFIUS doesn't do this now. That's not what they do. The export controls guys do that. And that's the concern that at least I have, and is that I'd rather just say, you export control experts, you need to work on figuring this stuff out because we're concerned. And maybe, by the way, we're not concerned about that technology leaking out to France or to the United Kingdom. We're concerned about it for China. And so what we need to do is we need to then go and talk to our allies who actually work with us on export control regimes because we actually have a multilateral system. In CFIUS, there is no multilateral system in CFIUS. There's some really good ideas out there. The Japanese, I think, have come up with some great ideas about how we should be working together on foreign investment restriction ideas. But they don't exist. The export control system is a multilateral system, but Kevin made the point earlier, you can control that technology, at least from the United States, and then you can start talking about it and using diplomacy and sales and so forth to basically say to the United Kingdom and Japan and France and Germany, blah, 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 hey, we need to control this because this is a real problem. And yeah, it's not on our export control list now, but we need to try to do it. And if they say, you know what, no, go pound sand. We still at least are controlling it here in the United States.
Just a quick question.
Yes, you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure, it's Rob Colorina. We're an investment group, U.S.-based. Question is with respect to capital structure. What if the form is funding is to debt or convertible debt?
Is a foreign investment into the United States type of thing, or like a loan to a U.S. company?
Whether a U.S. company or the domicile, but more so the structure being sort of non-equity at the beginning.
Okay. So currently, under CFIUS, forgetting all the form stuff, just currently, if you provide a loan to, and you're a foreign investment group, and you provide a loan to a U.S. entity, by the way, the U.S. entity can be a foreign entity, but there's a U.S. business aspect to it. That would not be under CFIUS unless it's a convertible loan where you can see them being able to get control. So there's an interesting example that's currently out there, which is, and I don't actually know how this is being done, so I'll just tell you the example, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. There's a Russian company that is invested in Citgo, which is of course owned by the Venezuelan government. They've provided a huge loan to Citgo, and that huge loan could convert if Citgo goes bad on the debt, and it could give them, I think it's a 49% stake, maybe a 51, but let's say it's a 49% stake because I'm not sure. Could that go through CFIUS? And the answer is it very well could. If basically you would have to, so what CFIUS would do under that circumstance is they would want to look at the loan documentation records, they would want to look at whatever rights the lender had under that circumstance, because the convertibility may actually provide control to that lender. So that actually exists within CFIUS now. If it was just a straight loan, like basically that Russian company had given Citgo just a ton of money and then Citgo went bad on it, but they had no convertibility equity rights, CFIUS has nothing to do with that.
And the way to answer this question is what is a covered transaction? So that was what is a covered transaction. That is any transaction where there would or could be the ability directly or indirectly to influence, alter the activities of a U.S. business. So that's the status quo, that's point number one. What FIRMA would do is add 5 other additional types of covered transactions. The second one would be the investment in real estate, which we've spoken about. The third one would be any inbound investment into a critical technology company that's not passive. The fourth one would be any change in a transaction that would cause a otherwise uncontrolled, uncovered transaction to become covered. The fifth one would be any outbound joint venture or other contribution by a critical technology company. And then the sixth one would be any transaction that was designed to evade or avoid any of the above. And so the way in which you go through and answer any CFIUS question about whether CFIUS would have jurisdiction, the status quo is exactly what Clay said, transaction, the ability to influence the activity of a U.S. business, and then with FIRMA, that's really what we're talking about, the expanded scope of ability to have, and where the teeth of CFIUS is not a regulatory requirement like export controls, thou shalt come in and get a license. It's, as mentioned, except with one exception, it's voluntary, but the real teeth and the reason companies come in and file and disclose is that by having jurisdiction, it means that for a completed transaction, CFIUS would have the ability to unwind or alter it after the fact, which the economic pain that would come from that to address a national security harm is what motivates companies to want to come in and get the safe harbor letter from CFIUS to say, dear CFIUS, this is our proposed transaction. Are you cool with it? We've in advance taken the self-mitigation measure to avoid these military items or whatever, and if we do this, may we have a letter from you saying that you're not going to unwind it later. So look at the covered transaction in order to get the safe harbor for later. Is that sort of a CFIUS 101?
So to talk about the bill itself, so as Kevin mentioned, there's some additional things like the real estate. And that sixth point though, that any of the above, there's that, there are other points within the bill which we were sort of talking about earlier, which kind of delineate the rulemaking down to the regulation side, which could be, I guess, without guidance, perhaps is something I would characterize it, and which could maybe, exacerbate or expand the rules even further. But of course, that would be, through the regulatory process and not necessarily through through congressional guidance.
Anyone else? Oh yeah, if you could introduce yourself.
What would you say to people who say, well, you can use the actual control route that you going to naturally, when you're gathering the community together and thinking about these technologies, have a broader scope of application? So to put AI broadly, right, for example, on a list as opposed to CFIUS, which in FIRMA obviously is trying to take the transactional approach and say, oh no, we're only going to look at it with the JV. And obviously, to your point that if we want to control the technology, we should control it. That makes sense. But what do you say to people who say that naturally that's going to have a broader application?
Sure. So did you all hear the question, which is, what would you say if in an export control realm, just simply artificial intelligence were identified as the controlled element for which licenses would be required to provide? And I would say that's an excellent point. And I would hope that in this process that is described in Senator Royce's bill, and then others have been saying, that what you would do is you would first you would identify what the threats are, working with the intelligence community and others, that the Chinese or others would present by virtue of their acquisition of artificial intelligence technology that's developed or could be developed in the United States or abroad, and then try to come, and I'm not smart enough to be able to do this is why a process is needed. You come up with the algorithms or the descriptions or the positive subsets of this topic, of this field of AI, and then you identify that, i.e. that which is tied to the threat. Because absolutely not everything involving machine learning or artificial intelligence is a threat. It may be cool, it may be spooky, it may be interesting, it may be weird, and we won't be able to understand it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a threat. And so I don't think anybody would advocate simply adding the words "and artificial intelligence" to the export control list. Legally, it could be done if that's a policy decision, but I think practically what would have to be done is for people smarter than me, hire Bill Nye into the U.S. government or something, and identify that subset, that universe of algorithms, that type of information, even a narrative description within that universe of that topic, and then impose controls there. And then the second thing, as I've said many times, to the extent that the threat with whatever that universe or that subset of information is not a worldwide threat, then the export control rules have the ability to tailor it to specific countries directly or indirectly, or if it's particular companies that are engaged in bad acts associated with that technology, to identify and impose controls on transactions with those specific companies. So it's easy to simply write AI, that legal authority exists. It's harder to work with the people and identify the threats to find the subset to list. Does that answer your question? Okay. But that's, I think, what should be done. That's why the system exists.
I think we have time for one last question.
Sure.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Taylor Hughes, and I'm with the Financial Services Committee.
Okay.
One of the witnesses at yesterday's Financial Services Committee hearing cast doubt on the ability of the export control system to be able to catch technology transfers in practice, even if it's given the authority to do so. You talked a little bit about the teeth, Mr. Wolf, that the CFIUS organization has. Could you compare the the tools available to both CFIUS and the export control system to be able to enforce the law and track down on evasion?
Sure. So the teeth in the export control system are the fact that there are civil and criminal penalties for non-compliance with requirements. Paying your taxes is voluntary, but if you don't do it, you get caught, you get prosecuted, you go to jail. If you export technology that's controlled without a license, and you get caught, you go to jail, if you do so willfully, etc. There's a fair point that's baked into that comment, but it's applicable equally to both CFIUS and export controls in that they're not all that well known, and generally are not all that well known by startups or companies that don't really have a regulatory compliance system. So CFIUS isn't the solution for the absence of knowledge about the export control system, because CFIUS is even more esoteric and doesn't directly have the same civil or criminal penalty structure. And within the Commerce Department system, we have 105, I get my pronouns right, the Commerce Department has 105 special agents who spend their days doing nothing but investigating and prosecuting, along with the FBI, DHS, and Justice, people who are required to get permission to transfer technology and don't. And there are civil criminal penalties associated with that. So I would say that the teeth of the export control system for noncompliance are significantly sharper than in the CFIUS system, that if someone engages in a covered transaction but doesn't file and get the safe harbor letter, and it's later discovered by CFIUS and unwound, the worst that can happen is that the transaction is unwound, absent a false statement, etc. Whereas with the export control system, there are criminal penalties for willfully violating them. And so the solution on both issues, and I was always a huge advocate when I was in the government, is massive amounts of education and outreach. And you know, just start planting CFIUS experts and export control experts in Silicon Valley and other parts of the country that are engaging in some of these novel technologies, and just get the word out to everybody everywhere all the time that there are these rules. And there are lots of rules that govern our daily lives. You have tax rules, you have environmental rules, you have labor rules, you have anti-discrimination rules. And if you're engaging in a transaction, it's your obligation to comply with them. And complying with them is a function of fear of going to jail and knowing about them in the first place. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And we have rules about finishing on time.
Yeah.
So please join me in thanking the moderator.